It is a great pleasure to welcome today's guests. And I want to welcome today's moderator, Julie Schumacher, um, who is a professor at the University of Minnesota. Professor Schumacher is the author of 10 books, including Dear Committee Members, which was a New York Times bestseller and won the Thurber Prize for American Humor. Professor Schumacher remains the only woman to win the Thurber Award. With pleasure, I turn things over to Professor Schumacher.
Thank you very much. Thanks to the Humphrey Center, to the faculty and staff at Humphrey for hosting this event. I have to just correct Professor Jacobs. There are now 2 women who've won the Thurber Prize, so that's a good thing. I'm going to introduce Charles Baxter very briefly because I mainly want to have a chance for us to have a conversation and for people later on in this hour-long program to put their questions into the Q&A so that Charlie can get to those a bit later. Charles Baxter is the author of 11 novels and/or collections of short fiction, as well as many books of poetry, essays, literary criticism. He's a National Book Award finalist. His novel for the Feast of Love, which was a finalist for the National Book Award, was made into a terrific movie with Morgan Freeman. And he recently retired from a distinguished professorship at the University of Minnesota. I'm a big Baxter fan. You'll be able to see that from my collection of some of his books here that I have just pulled from the shelf behind me. And I was so excited to read this new book, The Sun Collective. It's one of his best. It's such a great novel. I think in particular because it's funny, but it's also sad. It's satirical, but very earnest. It's political, but deeply personal and intimate, with such wonderful insight into human foibles and the human condition. And I hope this talk will give people a bit of a respite from politics, but that said, the novel is very thoroughly of this moment. And it is set in the city of Minneapolis, which has seen a lot of upheaval, as many parts of the country have, in 2020. So very happy to be talking to Charlie. There will be information on his book, if you would like to buy it, later on your screen. And I thought, Charlie, I'd ask you to just start by telling us where the book came from. Maybe give us a quick description for people who haven't yet read it.
Sure. When I've been thinking about where this book came from, I have come up, I think, with approximately 4 events, causes that led to it. And certainly one of them was that I ride the light rail, or I used to ride the light rail before the pandemic all the time. And when I was on the light rail, and sometimes when I was waiting for it, I would find myself in the company of homeless people. And I think most people tend to just avoid them, but I found that some of them like to talk and like to tell me about their situation, how they lived, where they slept, and a lot of that found its way into the novel. A second cause of the novel, which may seem very minor, but for me wasn't, was that I found myself one evening in a bar talking to a friend who was lecturing me about Google. And I think I had asked her innocently whether she had Google Maps, whereupon she said that she didn't want to have anything to do with Google or with the algorithms or with the patterns of purchasing and movement that she knew Google was storing. And did I know that Google was amassing all of this personal information on all of us for commercial and political purposes. And I thought, oh, that's very interesting. And it made me think that if there were to be an activist group that wanted to work politically, one of the things that they would have to think about would be whether they would do their work on the internet or whether they would be opposed to the internet and would be avoiding it. And so those were two elements. I think I had also been thinking about the political history of Minneapolis, in which my stepfather figured. And I had grown up hearing about the truckers' strike of 1934, the truckers versus the Citizens Alliance. And I was just thinking, well, Minneapolis has had this history of political movement. I didn't want to write a strictly political novel like It Can't Happen Here. I wanted to write something that was somewhere between political fantasy and comedy, which would slowly move into a suspense mode, starting in the middle of the book and going out to the end. I can give you a very brief plot summary if you think that would be helpful.
Yeah, I would love a brief plot summary. And in particular, this is a novel, but there are real life correspondences, I think, that are very interesting in the novel. There's a president, Amos Thorkelson, who bears a certain resemblance to the president of the US currently. There's a very large mall called the Utopia Mall, which bears a large resemblance to the Mall of America, which is located just outside of Minneapolis. So, yeah.
Yeah, I wanted to use as many of the settings of Minneapolis that I could, the sculpture garden, the Skyway, and the St. Paul Zoo, the Mall of America, they all figure into the book. Very briefly, I'll just say that the novel has two particular strands. One follows and has to do with an older couple, my age, retired, Harry and Alma Bredigan. And their retirement has now been taken up with a search for their adult son, whose name is Timothy, who seems to have gone deliberately to live among the homeless people in Minneapolis. And so Harry and Alma drive around, walk around, trying to find where their son is. And in his wanderings, Harry Bredigan encounters a homeless guy who tells him that there is a group called the Sandmen, and this group is made up of apparently young men coming in from the suburbs who are assaulting, if not actually killing, the poor and the homeless. And Harry Bredigan says to this guy, oh, that can't be true. That must be just a rumor. And the homeless guy says, no, it's really happening. And this is one of the first elements in the novel in which we get a sense that something in the air is based on rumor, speculation, and fantasy. In the second half of the second part of the plot, we have two characters named Christina Lobdell and her boyfriend, who is just known as Ludlow. She thinks of him as Ludlow because he's a Luddite. And these two people are attracted to a neighborhood activist group called the Sun Collective, where they meet Harry and Alma's son, Tim. And everything would be fine at that point with the convergence of Harry and Alma and Christina and Ludlow, if it weren't for the fact that Ludlow is a more traditional revolutionary, and he has some serious destruction on his mind. And it's at that point that the novel more or less stops being a comedy, to the extent that it has been a comedy, and takes on some of the elements of a suspense narrative. Well, we can talk about this later, but what Christina, who ends up, I think, being the hero of the book, really wants is to have a future for herself and for others. And that means preserving certain elements of the present, which is certainly something that Ludlow himself does not want to do.
Mhm. Yeah, and there are a few moments. Christina's a really interesting character because she's someone who, she's young, she wants change, she wants to make the world a better place. She refers at one moment to her desire to save the world, and asks about other people who are confronting, political, social difficulties. Where was their rage?
Right.
On the other hand, it seems difficult for her to figure out what to do with that rage, whether to put it in the Sun Collective, whether to trust these people, whether to do nothing, whether, as she sometimes does during the novel, just resort to a drug habit. She doesn't know what to do with her rage.
She doesn't know what to do with her rage, and I tried to make it clear that she has had a fairly traditional education in the university system. She has been trained in critical theory. She's very good at deconstruction. She's very good at intellectual skepticism. She's been trained not to believe things. At the same time, she wants to bring about some kind of social change. She just doesn't know how, and she's probably the most intelligent character in the book and the best educated, and she's underemployed. She's working as a receptionist at a bank. So when she arrives at the Sun Collective, she's not at all put off by their somewhat amorphous, disorganized way of doing things. She likes it that they have free stores, free boxes. She likes it that they are trying to rehabilitate street people. She likes it that they're thinking, or that they have a co-op grocery. These things all look very good to her. They're thinking of starting a co-op bank, but what really appeals to Christina more than anything else is that when she arrives at their meetings, she feels as if she's welcome there and that she belongs. She's like so many of us, she feels isolated. And when she gets into the meeting, she feels that she belonged there. I'll just read a paragraph. She's telling somebody of what it was like. "You should come," she said. "It's just, well, they told me that it had started as a neighborhood watch group. And after the world got worse, after President Torkelson was elected, that sort of transmogrified or something into a community garden collective, growing vegetables and sunflowers on a vacant lot, which is why they're called the Sun Collective. And then they branched out into neighborhood free boxes with clothes and shoes and overcoats for poor people. And they've been working on restoring." No, that's not the word. "Reclaiming." No, that's not the word either. "Homeless people." Anyway, they're getting former homeless people at the meeting, ex-addicts getting straightened. Yeah, it's kind of anarchic with some universal basic income proselytizers and democratic socialists. everybody arguing, just a bunch of chaotic subgroups, including urban farmers. She sighed. It made me happy. She sighed again. And they were real, actual people doing work in the world. It wasn't like just another chat group on the internet. So I was thinking it wasn't just the political aims they had, it was the fact that she felt welcome. And I think that's a very powerful attraction in contemporary life. God knows here in the middle of the pandemic, when we're also isolated, we all miss so many features of ordinary life, and one of them is just gathering with people. Sure. And that's what she finds so attractive. And she stays attracted to it until she realizes that Ludlow isn't content with the sort of ordinary improvements. He wants to do something else.
Mm-hmm. And I think Christina is a great contrast to the main character who starts off the book, Harold Bredigan. The book begins with this beautiful chapter of Harold Bredigan on the light rail in Minneapolis. He's a retired structural engineer. He's been married for 40 plus years to his wife, Alma. Again, father of 2 grown children, including Tim, the guy who has gone missing, absenting himself from their lives. And you have a great portrait of Bredigan's cranky but successful marriage to Alma. There's a moment where Alma believes that, she knew him so well, she could almost enter his dreams as a tour guide. And so much of the humor of the novel is, I think, involved in their marriage and their relationship. But how do you see Bredigan as a contrast to Christina? Early on in the novel, he's on the light rail, and he's gazing out the grimy window with the uneasy intelligence of someone who has few illusions to comfort him. I mean, maybe Christina is in search of those illusions, and he, as a person 1 generation older than she, no longer has those illusions and seems maybe content to live without them.
Yeah. Well, I felt that in structuring the novel, I really had to begin the book with somebody who is a kind of middle of the road character, somebody we can trust. And I say that because when we move into Christina's mental landscape, one of the things that we discover is that she's taking this drug much of the time, blue telephone, which I invented. And so she's much more volatile, and she lives in a kind of wonderland. The book itself begins in realism, but I think it doesn't stay there. It moves into what I would call a kind of wonderland, which is both real and not. But I feel you can't take the reader into wonderland too rapidly, because we won't believe it. So Harry Bredigan is the sort of guy you might see, the aged guy on the light rail going out to the Mall of America, or as I call it, the Utopian Mall, just in order to exercise with his geezer group. These are his friends from high school. And yet he's troubled by what he sees from the homeless people he encounters. And the first scene that we have in the book is one in which he has a conversation with a very strange sort of doctor named Arthur Jefferson, who in effect gives him what I would call a request moment. And the request moment is, whenever you see somebody who seems to be impoverished, you should give them money, because it's, the doctor says, Notre Seigneur en pauvre, our Lord in rags, you have to give money to the poor because it's a spot quiz for your salvation. So Harry Bredigan, oh, the other thing I should mention about him is that he's a bridge designer, a structural engineer. And so metaphorically, he's the kind of person who wants to build bridges from one place to another, from one group to another. And in the last pages of the book, he's thinking of a bridge he would design to take people from this world to the afterlife. So I thought of him as a likable companion for the reader and a sort of ambassador into the world of the novel, from realism into wherever it is we're going. I think of it as unrealism or wonderland, but different readers may see it in different ways.
Yeah, on the topic of realism, there's a character who at one point says the phrase, "I miss realism."
Right.
And there are references to the world of the novel, which again is mostly realistic, as being a post-truth environment.
Yeah.
What does that mean? What is a post-truth environment? Is that a commentary on where we are today?
I'm afraid so. I think our presentation is supposed to be away from politics, but this is one place where politics comes in. I wrote this book during the last 5 years, and when I began it, I was writing in what I would call a realist mode, but I had a moment about 4 years ago when I thought, realism in fiction of the kind that we all studied in school, 19th century British novel, 20th century American novel, even Russian novels, these books and these stories are all based on the assumption that the readers share the same view, more or less, of reality. And realism as a form of literature makes sense when everybody agrees on what reality is. But I think realism in fiction stops making sense when there is no general agreement on what reality is. And I think actually we have come to that moment. I think it is true that many of our fellow citizens no longer agree on what reality is. And that's partly because of the internet, partly because of speculation, conspiracy, things that might be true but aren't true. If we are in a post-truth environment, then it seems to me, as some of my characters say, they are nostalgic for reality. They wish reality would come back because they feel that they're living in a time when reality is no longer one thing. It has shifted into a condition of unreality.
Mhm.
And I think a lot of us feel that.
Mhm.
But you just open the paper and much of the news is about not actual fact, but about speculation.
Yeah, yeah. And I wanted to bring up the epigram at the beginning of the book, which is from a Lewis Simpson poem. And I suppose it refers to that passage when Bredigan is on the light rail and he's looking at the homeless and other folks on the light rail, and he refers to them in his own mind as victims of capitalism. V of C. Here are the V of C, he thinks. But the epigram at the start of the book is, "It's complicated being an American, having the money and the bad conscience both at the same time."
Right.
Where does that fit?
Well, it fits in the sense that if you're comfortable and if you're walking, let's say in downtown Minneapolis, as I do, and you see tents and homeless people, you think, what is my task? What should I be doing? I've done these bookstore presentations lately for a bookstore in Portland and one in Seattle and one in San Francisco. And it's getting to be our urban experience that we see the homeless in ever greater numbers. And it's difficult to know what you should be doing. You certainly can walk on and do nothing. You can stop and talk, which is what I often do. You can give money, but it's difficult being an American, having the money and the bad conscience both at the same time. Simpson goes on to say, perhaps this is not the right subject for a poem. So I think that's where we start from. And in fact, Harry believes that he is a man who is capable of violence of some kind, maybe revolutionary violence, but he's never done it. He awakens at night from dreams in which he's killed somebody. And he tells his wife, and Alma says, "Oh no, Harry, you're just totally harmless." And it's interesting, he doesn't take it as a compliment. American men, I think, do not take it as a compliment.
Right.
To be called harmless. I mean, if you're a young man and somebody says about you, hey, you're a really dangerous guy, that's a compliment.
Yeah.
So Harry is sort of on this cusp between thinking of himself as a really active male and someone who just contemplates or hasn't done enough.
I want to go back to the humor for a minute, because so much of this book is funny, even though so much of it is wrenching and about our political moment. Also, there are these slippages that the characters experience. Harry, inhabits very much the real world, but others feel the pull of some sort of mysticism or non-reality. And Alma, Harry's wife, after a sort of spell that she experiences, possibly a minor stroke while they're in the park, learns that she can talk to the dog and to the cat. And
not only can she talk to them,
they talk to her. Sorry.
They talk to her. And what they say is completely comprehensible to her, although not to the other members of the household.
But eventually Bredigan does some speaking to the animals himself. He doesn't speak to them in long conversations the way that Alma, his wife, does. But would you read? There's a section on 131 when
Sure.
some conversation with the dog and the cat, and it's just they help point out some of the vivid strangeness of the marriage between Harry and Alma and their characters.
Yeah, and before I read this, and the listeners think that I'm completely off my rocker, I'll just say that I had noticed, I think in the houses of two friends, people speaking to their pets. And I noticed in one case, there was a moment almost of listening when I thought the person was listening to the response from the animal. Anyway, here's the passage. That night, sleepless again at 2 a.m., sporting a clean pair of blue jeans and a windbreaker over his t-shirt, but with the same straw flat brim hat he had worn the night before to give himself the appearance of genteel refinement, Bredigan put the leash on the dog's collar, and together, the two of them, man and dog, went out the front door and down the block, the dog nervously glancing up from time to time to inquire about the purpose of this nighttime stroll. You'll see, Bredigan told the dog quietly, so as not to rouse his neighbors. I thought dogs liked adventures. I was sleeping, the dog said. You woke me up. Well, you can sleep during the day if you want to, Bredigan said, sotto voce. I don't get it, the dog said. What are we doing out here? Well, I was curious about Albert. I'm curious about the Sandman. And then there's a moment when suddenly Harry's wife appears. Talking to yourself? And there she was, Alma, his wife, who had caught up with him and now put her arm in his. She was wearing anything that she had found in the dark bedroom after he had left. I feel that particularly in a novel which has some political overtones, it's important to get the reader to laugh. If you can get the reader to laugh as a writer, you can get away with anything.
You can get away with
And the book no longer seems point making. It can seem entertaining, and it can seem like a page turner. And in fact, as you may know, I wanted to give the dog and the cat the last word. The next to last chapter was the one that I had intended to end the novel with, in which the dog and the cat are speaking to Alma. And my editor is not one to throw fits, and he didn't really throw a fit, but he said, you can't do that. I said, I can't. And he said, no, you've got this book ending with the dog speaking, and you have to reverse. You have to reverse the order. He was right, of course, but I did. If I can have your indulgence, I'll just read a quick moment. Alma is at home, and Harry hasn't shown up in the way that he usually does. He's like me, he's a man of routine. He comes back the same time every day. And Alma is sitting in the living room, and the dog and the cat are in front of her. And they're sitting patiently, and she's sitting patiently. And she thinks or says, where's my husband? Doing whatever he does, the cat says. You should learn to wait. Patience. Well, I've been patient with that guy all my life, Alma says. In that case, be patient now. Another hour passes, and now Alma's irritation is being mixed increasingly with worry. Where is he? This isn't like him. What's like him? To let me know where he is if something happens. He always returns, the dog observes. Same time every day. Well, you say that because you're a dog. So? I just don't know what got into him. He never does this. He never does this. He just never does. Maybe he got lost, the cat says. Maybe he took off somewhere. You're heartless, Alma says to the cat. No, realistic. The room is beginning to darken slightly as the afternoon goes on. He'll come back. He always comes back, the dog repeats. Well, how do you know? Alma asks. Loyalty and love, the dog says. What else is there? And that was going to be the last line of the novel. Loyalty and love. What else is there? But now it's been switched. I tried to make the dog and the cat sound like an actual dog and cat.
Oh, they totally do. Of course they do. Well, and there are other sort of mystical aspects. You mentioned Arthur Jefferson, who's a sort of Wizard of Oz-like figure who appears initially on the light rail. And he suggests at one point to Bredigan a cure for afflictions, anything that is plaguing or bothering him. And this cure consists of Bredigan washing his reflected face in a mirror
Yeah.
underwater, which
Yeah.
he attempts to do.
Yeah, I had, you asked earlier what some of the catalysts, the background for this novel was. And I had been reading in a book or a couple of books about by coincidence, this was 4 or 5 years ago, the history of the 1918 Spanish flu epidemic, which my mother lived through on 2817 Pillsbury Avenue South in Minneapolis. And she told me about black crepe paper being put up in front of the door in houses where people were sick. But she also told me, and I found this in a history of folklore cures for the influenza, the 1918 flu epidemic, that it was thought that germs for the disease nested in mirrors. And so my mother said that they had taken all the mirrors in the house out and washed them. And it was considered to be a folklore or country cure to take a mirror. This is more in the South. You take a mirror, you go to where there is flowing water, a stream, you drop the mirror into the river, and you wash your face in it. You wash your reflected face. And obviously it's a kind of magic, folklore, cure. And you can read, there's a poem by John Knopfel, who lived in Missouri, about this cure.
Mm-hmm.
But I thought it was such an extraordinarily strange and wonderful thing that I would start my novel with this strange wizard-like person, Arthur Jefferson, who gives Bredigan two commands or suggestions. One is to give money to the poor, and the other is to wash your face in a mirror, in a reflected, in a flowing stream, which, as it turns out, Bredigan does, except he does it not to himself, but to his wife, Alma. He drops a mirror and then tilts the mirror so that Alma's, his wife's, image appears, and he starts to wash it. And in what's really the novel's first movement into a wonderland, they seem to enter a kind of time warp where they're both college students again in the mirror. And it causes Alma's mini stroke or whatever it is. And after that, she's able to talk to the dog and the cat. I hope that these episodes are both true and a little strange and funny before the novel gets as dark as it is going to get.
I have loads more questions, but there are questions lighting up in the Q&A, so I'll turn to some of those. One person wants to know or wants to hear more about how President Thorkelson figures into the novel.
He's a minor figure. You never see him. He is a figure almost out of Sinclair Lewis's It Can't Happen Here, or out of Robert Penn Warren's All the King's Men. He has a nickname, Coach, and those of you with long memories or encyclopedias will remember that there was a figure named Amos Alonzo Stagg, who was a football coach and a basketball coach in the early part of the 20th century. Torkelson is a name from, and I'm going to forget his full name, a member of Congress from Montana, I think. You can look it up. He was a famous segregationist and reactionary. Torkelson is a kind of folksy president, and he's both what? He's kind of a comedic figure. He's proposing, for example, a 41% tax on books. It's the same rate of taxation on books that you find on cigarettes, because he has these phrases that he keeps repeating. And one of the phrases is, some things don't bear very much looking into. You're better off not looking into all of these books. Therefore, we're going to tax them at 41%. And he's dissolved, what has he dissolved? The Supreme Court. He's generally a comic figure. He's a very small part of the book, but to the extent that I was writing the book in the last 4 years, Torkelson, who likes to be called Coach, is one of those sort of folksy political figures who's also involved in the creation of rumor and speculation and conspiracy. But I tried to do all of that in a comic way. I didn't want it to seem as if I'm delivering some kind of sermon.
Here's another question about names in the novel. The name Alma means soul, or
it means soul.
And
it means soul.
Points out that it has a nurturing quality. And do
yes.
you see Alma as a soul-like person or a pillar in their society?
She absolutely is. And she is, she has greater depth of feeling than her husband does. And when she sees, she's on his birthday, she's in the Minneapolis Skyway, and she's off to find him a shirt for a birthday present. And what she sees is a man down on all fours in the Skyway. She's over by the lumber building. Mm-hmm. And he's making groans, and she's so shocked by the sight of this, which incidentally I saw in the Skyway, that it gets to her right here. She can hardly speak after that. And she is, for Harry, they have one of those marriages that's gone on for decades. As Julie said, she knows all of his dreams so well that she could give a tour in them. They're both kind of tired of each other in the way that long-term marriages sometimes can be. They know each other's stories, they know each other's habits, but Harry says to her at one point, or he thinks, you don't have to love water, but you have to have water to live. Mm-hmm. And that's the way he feels about Alma. Mm-hmm. And she really is his soul.
Yeah. And there are a lot of people in the novel who seem to be seekers or obsessed with, concerned with the soul. At one point, Christina describes Ludlow as a person who had an unkempt and disorderly soul. And Timothy, the son who's gone missing, is referred to as misplaced,
Yeah.
rather than
Yeah.
missing or disappeared. So there is this. Are all of the characters seekers?
Well, in different kinds of seeking. Timothy, I've had a couple of friends who were actors. And at one time, in high school, I wanted to be an actor. And I started to think about what it would be like to be a really terrific mimic or actor. And I came to feel that you could have a crisis in your early 20s when you'd say, well, I can play this role and this role and this role and this role, but who am I? What kind of person am I? And so Timothy really is on a search of the kind that you described to find out who he is. And the place that he goes for that is the street.
Mm-hmm.
He doesn't go to a psychiatrist. He doesn't go to a therapist. He doesn't go to a class. He goes out into the street. I was thinking of two things. There's a book by Kierkegaard called The Crisis in the Life of an Actress, which is about a Danish actress who had a kind of breakdown because she didn't know who she was. I was thinking about that, and I was thinking about the story of Pinocchio, who wants to be a real boy. Mm-hmm. And I suppose in the course of the book, I was also thinking of somebody like Christina, who wants to belong to a group and wants to have a mission. She really wants to save people. She wants to save the world, and she gives up a lot in the course of the novel in order to do that. She's very brave. For me, Christina took over the narrative.
Yeah. I'm going to combine a bunch of questions and ask you. A number of people are asking about influences that might have borne on the making of this novel. One person is reminded of Carol Shields' novel Unless. Someone else reminded of Vonnegut and Fitzgerald and The Great Gatsby. And somebody has asked whether if you lived in Ann Arbor for years before moving to Minneapolis, could this novel have been set in a different city, in Ann Arbor instead of Minneapolis? So what sort of influences, both literary and in terms of the city in which you now live?
Yeah, great questions. The book might have been set in Ann Arbor. I set The Feast of Love in Ann Arbor, but partly because that city is full of people who love to talk. And they're just, anywhere you go in Ann Arbor, you run into these loquacious characters. And I thought that was very good for that particular novel. I love Vonnegut, and I love the sort of mixture of comic anxiety and social speculation that his books have, but particularly Cat's Cradle. But for what I wanted in this book, let me go back to this question. I thought that Minneapolis was the ideal place for this particular story, partly because of the growth of homeless encampments here, partly because the city seems to be somewhat politically volatile, partly because it's my home and I know the different parts of the city, and also because of its political history. As for influences, the greatest influence on the Sun Collective is a Russian novel that not very many American readers know, but which I think is one of the great novels of political fantasy. It's a comic novel, but is very deeply moving and very political. I'll hold it up. It's by Mikhail Bulgakov. And the title is The Master and Margarita. And my little tip of the hat to The Master and Margarita is that there is a talking cat in The Master and Margarita who's part of Satan's retinue. And the talking cat is named Behemoth. Same name as the cat, the talking cat in my novel. And Satan in The Master and Margarita. And you have to remember that The Master and Margarita is mostly a comic novel with some very, very dark parts attached to it. But Satan, who is a kind of comic figure in The Master and Margarita, is named Woland or Voland, which is the same name as the dog in my book. I tried to stay away from some of the other novels of communal alternative life. Dana Spiata has written a couple of books. Eat the Document is one of them. And Lauren Groff has written a book about communes. T. Cora Hesson Boyle has written a novel about communes. I didn't want to write that kind of book where the day-to-day life of a commune or an alternative way of being is laid out in detail. I want to go through all that much faster and have the Sun Collective over there at a distance. It's a little hard to see. What I was interested in was how such a group might arise and the way that people might glom onto it and then possibly turn it to more, who knows, violent means.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, well, you held up Master and Margarita. I'm going to hold up here. It's a great book to give someone as a gift, and it's a beautiful read. You have a couple of moments toward the end of the novel when characters disparage novels. Reminded me of some of Jane Austen's characters who have disparaging things to say about the works in which they are living. But Bredigan refers to himself as once a reader of fiction, but in middle age he grew to despise it. Fiction was like quicksand, dragging you down. Later on, Bredigan says to someone else, no one reads novels, but you're a novelist. What are those sentences doing in there? Why are people reading and writing novels now if we are in this post-realist phase, if we're in a time of crisis? What do you have to say about the novel?
Two things. Bredigan was a reader of fiction when he was young. And I've noticed, particularly among men, that they have a love of fiction when they're young, and then the real life takes over and they're not interested in fiction anymore. In the second scene, Bredigan is in a barbershop and they're talking about a novel called Prometheus Unchained. And Bredigan says, nobody reads novels. And the people in the barbershop say, well, they read this one. And if you read between the lines, the novel they're talking about is Atlas Shrugged, which there's a paragraph in which the Speaker of the House of Representatives has been influenced by Prometheus Unchained, the Secretary of the Treasury. I was thinking of Paul Ryan and Alan Greenspan and all of these people who had been in rationalist societies. I mean, you can make the argument that the most influential American novel of the 20th century whether you like it or not, is not The Great Gatsby. It is not Invisible Man by Ralph Ellison. It's not Another Country. It's not Toni Morrison. It's Atlas Shrugged. In fact, I read Atlas Shrugged while I was writing this novel, or at least John Galt's sermon, because I thought, well, I've got to find out what they're saying. But that's an influential novel. People read it. Who is John Galt? On the bumper sticker. Yeah.
Yeah. Well, I think, unfortunately, we're out of time, but I'll end on the fact that someone has put in the chat that having been a fan of your work for many years, we named our dog Baxter and had wonderful conversations with him for 15 years.
That's great.
So I think that's
Great.
a good
Thank you.
nod between real life and fantasy there. And thanks, Charlie, and everybody. This is a great book.
Thank you. Thank you, Julie. Thank you to the Humphrey School. Thanks to everybody for setting this up. And thanks to those who came.
Yes. Take care.